Here's a story from antiquity. I don't know whether it's an invented story or not. The story goes back to 64 BC. There's this guy named Publius Ovid Naso. He's only mentioned in this one Roman inscription that we have, and he was a freedman. So he used to be a slave, but he got freed. And he dedicated this altar to Minerva, which is the Roman goddess of wisdom. And he also dedicated it to Apollo, god of music, poetry, and light, and all sorts of things. And he called himself in the inscription poet and performer. Now there's nothing else about him, apart from this one other inscription saying that he was a priest of Apollo. And by the way, they both happened in Athens. So it seems like this guy left Rome and went to Athens. And anyway, here is the story according to that altar. So there was a king of Pontus, that's a kingdom up north of what is now Turkey, and his name was and his father was King Mithridates VI, but he was known as the Great, and that too is a real name. And his mother was a lady named Cleopatra Thea, again, a real name, and she was the daughter of King Ptolemy I of Egypt. You may have heard of him. Anyway, King Mithridates the Great had this beautiful daughter, and her name was Iphigenia, which you might recognize from the Greek myth about Agamemnon and the Trojan War. So apparently that name was popular. Anyway, King Mithridates the Great wanted his daughter to marry the king of the neighboring kingdom of Cappadocia, which is also in Anatolia, modern Turkey. And so he summoned his courtiers to find someone who would go and ask for her hand in marriage, but nobody volunteered. Apparently nobody wanted to do that because King Mithridates was notoriously bad news. He was dangerous. So then finally this guy stepped forward. His name was Archimedes. I think that's how you pronounce it. He said, "Fine, I'll go. No problem. Send me off with some gifts and I'll go and ask for the hand of the king's daughter in marriage for the king of Cappadocia." So he gets all these gifts and off he goes. And soon he arrives at the court of King Mithridates, and he's trembling. He's nervous. He offers the gifts to the king. He says, "Look, I come from the king of Cappadocia. He wants to marry your daughter." And the king nearly explodes. He's furious. He throws the gifts away, chases Archimedes out of the courtyard and has him beaten. And then he locks him in a tower, and he keeps him there for 3 years until he eventually dies. And after 3 years, the king calms down a little bit, but he still doesn't want anybody asking for the hand of his daughter. So instead he summons a group of bards. He summons poets, and he says, "Listen, you guys write me some poems. Write me some songs about how awesome my daughter is, how beautiful she is, how lucky any guy would be to marry her, and the winner gets to marry her." So the poets take their time, they write their songs, and then they perform them before the king and his daughter and the judges, right? Like a singing competition or something. And sure enough, Ovid, this freedman turned poet, he shows up. He performs. He does a great job. He wins the competition. He's very happy and he's like, "Great, I get to marry the princess." But King Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, he hears about this and he comes over, and he's angry because he thinks, "Wait a minute, she's my niece and I never got asked to marry her off to anyone. And besides, he has someone else in mind for her." And so he forces her to marry his son instead. And Ovid is devastated. He loses his girl. He leaves the kingdom and he wanders around the Mediterranean for a few years. He runs into Pythagoras, the philosopher. They become friends, and Pythagoras tells him, "Hey, you need to get over this." He says, "Look, I know a place where there are 100 virgin maidens, all uncorrupted, all beautiful and pure." And so he takes Ovid there and introduces him to the maidens, and sure enough, one of them named Sappho becomes his wife. And they live together for 4 years and they have kids and he loves her and he loves his life. But then Pythagoras dies. And once again, Ovid is alone. Now he's a little older, but he's still pretty good looking. So he decides to try again to win a woman. And so he goes to Athens. And there he meets this rich woman named Julia. And he marries her. And he thinks, "Wow, I've struck it rich." But then she dies after just 1 year. So he's back at square one. But fortunately, in Athens, he meets a man named Titus Fannius. Now, Titus Fannius wasn't born into slavery, but he became a slave through no fault of his own. He was captured by pirates. He got rescued by the Romans, and then he was freed. But his wife and his kids were sold to a brothel, and so he is really down on his luck. And he's friends with Ovid. Ovid feels sorry for him, and he says, "Look, you gotta cheer up." He says, "I'm gonna make you a present. I'm gonna get you a brand new wife." And he does. He finds this young woman named Frugi. She's only 14 years old. But Ovid says, "Don't worry. She's been taught everything she needs to teach. You're gonna love her." So he introduces them, and sure enough, Titus Fannius marries this young girl. But after the wedding, Ovid is really worried because he's like, "Did I do the right thing? Is this okay?" am I a bad person for doing this? And so he writes a poem about it and he sends it to his friend, the historian Tacitus. And he asks him, "What do you think? Was this wrong? Should I have done this?" And Tacitus replies, "Well, you didn't do anything wrong." But Ovid, being a poet, obviously can't stop there. He's got to embellish it a little bit. And so he publishes this whole story as a poem, including his conversation with Titus Phoenicius and his wife. And naturally, in those days, people thought that was hilarious. It was scandalous. So Ovid is now famous throughout the empire. He's the greatest living poet, he thinks, and he's thinking, wow, I'm hot stuff. But then he makes a couple mistakes. He makes a couple enemies. He gets kicked out of town by the emperor. He's exiled to a remote village in the mountains of Exile, where he lives out the rest of his days. And when the villagers come to him and say, "Hey, will you perform for us? We'd love to hear some of your poetry," he says, "I'm not in the mood. Get away. Leave me alone." And so he spends his last years bitter and alone, writing nasty poetry about all the people who wronged him, including that stupid king from Pontus. So, that's the story of Ovid. I don't know if it's true, but it's a fun story, either way. And, it raises a bunch of questions. For instance, if you look at the inscription where this guy calls himself a poet and a performer, maybe he was actually performing these stories. Maybe he was a traveling performer who would go around and tell these scandalous stories and people would pay to see them. We just don't know. Anyway, let me know in the comments. What do you think? And thanks for watching. Here's another video you can watch.